Thank you. All right. People online, can you hear me now?
Yes,
Okay.
We can hear you now. Yeah.
Great. So I will skip introducing myself. Let's just say I joined Regent's College only 6 months ago, but I've been at the anthropology department for a longer time span, for the last 10 years, actually. So the questions I would like to answer in my talk today, or at least make a start of an answer, is: do religiously tolerant societies become more peaceful, stable, cohesive, and affluent? Or is it the other way around? Or is it a mixture of both processes in play? Or is there not much correlation at all? And in many, it seems it's a seemingly straightforward question, and it might come as a surprise to you. The answer is actually not that well known, as in that there is debate about it, and that there is ultimately little research done about it. So if I show you my next slide, these are 2 quotes from scholars in the field, very much. No. Okay. From 2 scholars in the field, arriving at the same tension, but from a different angle. One of them is Brian Grimm, and the other person is Roger Fink. It is not, if I summarize the debate, it is not that there is an intense debate going on. It is not that there are 2 very well-known schools of thought battling it out and fielding data set after data set to provide support for their own view. It is actually the other way around. There is little debate about it. These things are often assumed, but much less researched. In my paper, I would like to highlight why this is an important question, why it is such a hard question. I would also like to show you that in the ideal world, what steps are needed to answer this question conclusively. I will also run you through my attempt, which is obviously more pragmatic and which is focusing on the amount of resources I have at my availability to make an attempt to that. And in my talk, I will take international development as a starting point. I will try to bring history to the table, as this is ultimately my own background. And as a result, I will introduce you to a trade-off between the promise of exploring temporal dynamics, which I think is absolutely key to get this question, an answer to this question, but also it means that we need to be much more crude in the data that we gather. Obviously, the more recent your data set is, the more complete or more thorough it can be. You can query people, you can ask them what they think, you can do an experiment and so on. If you are looking into the past, it obviously people are dead and you have lost that opportunity. It will also, I think, highlight that I'm very much a methodologist that came from this background to the question of religious freedom and freedom of religion or belief, rather than the other way around. So I have designed an approach to study world history, and I apply it on the topic of freedom of religion or belief, very much on the other way around, say I am a scholar of freedom of religion and belief for the last 20 years, and I would like to use a new methodology to unpack that question. And chiefly, I will run you through my project before, the Seshat Global History Data Bank. And I'm interrupted by someone, sorry.
For people online.
I can do anything you say. Yeah.
So we could maybe just stop sharing and start sharing again, so we can reactivate.
Okay. Right.
Sorry about that.
That's fine. Okay. And I'll do it again. Right.
So they can see the results.
Right. How do I get?
There we go. Yes.
How do I get it to share? Oh, I'm in your hands. Okay. And there it is.
On that computer,
Oh, no, new share. No, new share. Please stop share. Is that what you say?
Because it's
Do
connected.
you want
to
to
the best
new
one.
share?
Yeah,
Oh, yeah, that's it. Okay, fine.
So now they can see the whole thing.
All right.
Regent, okay. Now
All right.
we can minimize this
Yeah.
one. Yeah, thank you.
Right.
And I'll put this so they can hear your voice.
Yeah.
Because the tendency to face.
Okay. Apologies about the interruption. I really hope this is now fixed. If I'm just going to run. Yes, and can you see if I run through the slides? No. Okay, maybe if I do this, can you see that? No. Is it? But it's no longer moving on my screen. Yeah. Oh no, now it is on me as well. Okay, wait up. Apologies for the next interruption. I really hope that's wrapped up now. All right. So why is it an important question? I mean, and just to remind you, the question was, do religious tolerant societies become more peaceful, or is it the other way around? I mean, that's an easy question to answer. How could it not be an important question? I think the end goal with these things is clear. I think we all want stable, cohesive, and tolerant societies. But the process on how to get there, that's where the different assumptions start to show up. Do you focus foremost or only even on economic development? Do you focus foremost or only on strengthening peace within a society? Or do you focus on making societies tolerant? Or do you simply claim it's all important and we need to do all these things at once, which is also a choice, of course, because that means you give equal weighting to all these things. With my own research, I hope to help policymakers to know where they have to put an emphasis on. And so far in international development, at least in my view, this is done largely because of ideological reasons rather than empirical driven reasons. If I think of the role of religion in international development, one could easily argue, I feel, that until 1980s, that the role of religion was deliberately minimized. International development was very much a secular phenomenon, and that's largely driven also by modernization or secularization theories, especially within Europe and the US. And it was almost saying we don't need to promote or even engage with religious actors. Let's run international development through the state, through secular agencies, and so on. Religion started to push for a seat at the table very much more from the 90s onwards. And the argument was twofold. Firstly, of all the modernization theory really run into trouble. Religion was there to stay, was not going to go away. But also in order to access the most marginalized communities, very often it were religious actors who had the best access to it. And by positioning international development very much as secular, why would you exclude yourself from those avenues and so on? So I think by now it is fair to say that religion is one of the usual suspects within the international development world, still not the most prominent one, but it has a seat at the table, just as, for example, gender rights has, obviously the fight for poverty, reproduction rights, and so on. So I would say it's one of those usual suspects. My own research is funded by the FCDO. For example, the larger scheme through which it was funded had 8 strands, and freedom of religion and belief was actually one of those 8. And I don't think that's a totally atypical situation. At the same time, value for money questions are being asked very much so within international development world, and saying, well, where can you actually demonstrate the added value of engaging with religious actors and promoting freedom of religion or belief or religious freedom? It is one claim to say that religious actors give us access to some of the most marginalized communities, but is this simply a story about having access to, or is there an added value in saying, no, it's the religious tolerant societies by the virtue of being religiously tolerant that actually lead to better development? Now, these are two different arguments. So in very much FCDO, but also other funding bodies would like to have an empirical basis to understand these dilemmas slightly better. And hence also the work I'm trying to do. Moving on to my next question. Why is it such a hard although seemingly straightforward question, and what has been done. As I already mentioned, key observation is not that this is a hugely busy academic debate about which is the driver of the other one. No, it is largely a debate about assumptions, and relatively little research, especially quantifying research, has been done on bringing those two models head to head. So there are few direct studies. Furthermore, virtually all of them have a shallow time dimension. So the longest study that I know of that is bringing those competing hypotheses head to head had a time span from 1990 to 2014. So we're looking at 24-year temporal dimension. Now, it is very hard if you bring in two competing models, two competing explanations, to say which one is driving which one, or which combination of the two is it. How do you separate between correlation and causation if you have a very shallow time depth? It is, statistically speaking, you have raised the bar a lot higher than if you were to have lots of temporal data. Another observation there is that the gray literature, basically the literature which acts or accompanies some of the more academic work, but is driven by NGOs, is by white papers and so on, has a much more cavalier attitude to it. They do take for granted often, or they make stronger claims than the academic work has actually allowed you to make, saying it's religious freedom which is driving peaceful, stable, cohesive societies. And the evidence of that is often that they refer to other papers from that gray literature, and they do obviously refer also to some of the academic work, but if you look at the conclusions are quite more nuanced. So I am, I think, very appreciative of what is there, simply because it is incredibly hard to do global research, data-driven, especially if you have, if you want to bring temporal data to the table. But I also think it's fair to say that much more research is needed. Firstly, I think we need more data sets. At the moment, we are talking about 3 or 4 usual suspects in the data sets which have been used and reused, which is obviously great time and again. A lot of the explanatory weight is linked ultimately to freedom of religion or belief reporting done by government agencies about the situation in each country and how that changes over the years. But the reporting, as I said, only goes back a few decades. But there are other ways to look into that. We can run more surveys, we can do interventions, we can run experiments and so on. So I think we need to diversify the data sets on which conclusions are being hinged at the moment. As I said before, we really need to bring time depth to the table. If we want to understand temporal dynamics, especially if there are feedback loops of, for example, yes, it's only at a certain level of economic development that religious tolerance becomes key, important to go to the next phase, and so on. One needs that time depth to unpack correlation and causation. We need life cycle data, not only about societies, but also about conflicts, about persecution, about discrimination, and so on. And that, in a way, allows us to ask different questions, because very often the question now being raised is a very simple one. It's a kind of tap-on, tap-off model in which says, should we open the tap of religious freedom or should we not do so? Should we, as an international development community, invest in that or not invest in that? But I think we need to move away from that black and white perspective and say, when exactly do we need to open the tap of religious freedom? When does it need support? When does it need promotion? Is that at any point in the life cycle of a conflict of society, or is it at specific points that the value for money, that the most efficiency will be gained? These are, for me, the questions that really matter. So ideally, we have a tool which tracks levels of freedom of religion or belief or religious freedom and the changes to it year by year, going back a lot longer than 10 to 20 years. And we have a same tool which also tracks, in a way, the health, the well-being, the stability, and the wealth of countries. Furthermore, I think we then need to make the next step and turn that into a diagnostic tool. How can the past lessons data set feed into that and yield an early trigger warning system and saying, from what point in time do we need to get worried about religious freedom? At what point in time do we need to get worried about civil war and so on? And I think that's obviously when I try to pitch the idea to the FCDO, this is the bit obviously they were most interested in. Furthermore, and I think it was the last step, in that case, we then need to design interventions and test, does it actually work? Can we demonstrate that interventions add value? Can we see that in our indexes showing up? And I think my attempt for the next bit of my talk is to show you how I try to achieve that. So it's a different engagement with one of those perennial questions. It's one which brings the past to the table. And I mean, and it will be work in progress, but you will see that most of the work there has been done. The diagnostic tool and so on is more for the future of the project. And here we need to make a step back and we need to introduce you to, the method or that I and two colleagues have designed, and it's called the Seshat Global History Data Bank. Now, Seshat stands for the ancient Egyptian goddess of the scribe, of basically of knowledge. So she kept track of the flood data of the Nile. And as a result, in a way, you could argue she keeps track of how healthy society is, and she does that every year. So we found it as a good name for our database, which we founded together with Harvey Whitehouse and Peter Turchin in 2011. If I just run you through the slide very quickly, it's a vast web of facts about past societies, and very often the premise is that these facts in a queryable format are inaccessible because they're buried in individual books, sometimes in the minds of historians, area scholars, theologians, and so on. How can we link the data on a global scale? So Seshat will allow us to connect facts about the past. You can query it spatially, temporally, thematically, even conceptually. And very much what the problem it was designed, when we designed it, was to do was the cherry picking problem. If you ask a historian to speak to a certain global or universal theory, or a theory that has good traction in the social sciences, they can come and say like, well, this is true because in my area of specialty, I have evidence for that. Or I'm rather unsure because I'm an expert in two areas and one fits your model and the other one doesn't, and so on and so forth. But how do you scale that up? How do you, if you want to study universal trends, how do you go to a different type of world history quantified? And that was really in 2011, the work we tried to get going. And I'll run you briefly through the methodology that we designed. Our vision was to have thousands of variables, or we can call them questions. Obviously, well, we didn't want just questions, we also wanted the answers, of theoretically motivated variables. So we don't want to be a database about anything. We want to be a database that allows you to test specific theories. So otherwise, it's endless, the work. So we wanted to have thousands of variables, and we wanted the answers on those for every year since Neolithic Revolution till today, and for every geographic point in the world. That was the vision. I'm not saying we immediately got that, of course. So the first step we did was that we designed a world sample. So we already cut away a lot of the claim on every geographic point in the world already went away by saying we're actually going to look at 30 time series in first instance. And as you can see there, you see world region. These are the 10 world regions as defined by UNESCO, which we took over or adopted. And then we said we want in each of these world regions, so you see Africa, Europe, Central Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, and so on. We wanted one area in which we know that social complexity, which is a standard term in anthropology, arose early. We also wanted one area where we know that social complexity arose late. And then we wanted one area where it sits somewhere in the middle. So that is obviously a pragmatic choice, right? So if I bring you to Europe, and now it's buried a little bit under the header there, but I would give you Latium, the area around Rome as an early example, the Paris Basin as a middle one, and the area around Reykjavik in Iceland as a late arrival of social complexity, which was around 1000 CE. So we said, well, if we can capture data on those 30 time series, we have a first start of making kind of global claims. I need to tell you, by now we're already working at 45 of these time series. So we have expanded that, and the plan is actually to expand that massively. Just to give you an idea, if you have 45 of these time series, that covers already much more than half of the total population that was ever alive. So this is not a small sample we're talking about, because obviously it samples very big polities. So then the next step was, then the next step is that for each of these pieces of real estate, we looked at which societies ruled that piece of land or real estate. So here you see the sequence of polities or societies that occupied what we call the Upper Egypt NGA. So that's that piece of real estate. So and this is the oldest sequence we have. And obviously, after New Kingdom Ramesside, it keeps going and going. So for some of the very early social complexity areas, we sometimes have a sequence of up to 35 of these polities. If we go for late arrival of social complexity, we sometimes only have a sequence of 4 or 5 of these polities, and they can become much longer as well each. So, right, so then we have basically in total 500 historical polities if you add up the data, all these polities for each of these time series. The next step is that I'll show you, we basically ask for each of these polities for each year. They were around the same 2,000 questions. And they are, just to give you an idea, what's in our code book, they are pertaining to social complexity, which is really, roughly speaking, the big makeup of the society. So they are very detailed about warfare, religion, ritual, agriculture, norms, institution, economics, and so on. I'll give you an example of such a fact, or basically this is the answer on one variable for one society, for one slice of history. And it's basically, we are interested in the population and the capital of the polity. In this case, it's Egypt, New Kingdom Ramesside. And we have, as you can see, there a number between 250,000 and 300,000. You see, it's all between brackets because we not only capture that, we also capture levels of disagreement and levels of uncertainty about it. Disagreement means that scholars are certain about the answer, but 2 scholars just differ about it. So one scholar says this is the correct answer, another scholar says it's a different answer. Levels of uncertainty is that the scholars agree, but they say we can't pinpoint it. It's a range. We just know that it is between those 2. So here we have, there is certainty, it's between 250,000 and 300,000. And then obviously we collect information to the literature. And we also, as you can see, we actually organized a workshop in 2014 about, because there was initially disagreement about a set of variables to do with ancient Egypt, that we brought 8-9 scholars together and said, can we have a conversation and see if we can reduce the number of variables in which there is disagreement, right? So just to sum up, at the moment, we have 42 time series, NGAs, we have 500 plus polities, we have data already on 1,500 variables. And if you think about that factor they show you, by now we have close to probably 150,000 of those facts in the database. Now, what does this allow us to do? And I'll show you very, just for an illustrative purposes, I'll show it how we operationalized this approach to actually generate knowledge. So social complexity is a very popular term in anthropology. And in a way, it's kind of an index which allows you to compare societies cross-culturally. So it gives you an idea on, no matter in a way how high they score on the list or how low they score, you can have an informed debate about it. The problem is, which dimensions do you put into that concept of social complexity? So you have a school of thought that says, like, when all is said and done, you just need to know the total population number. This is ultimately what drives social complexity. You have another school of thought that said, no, it's multidimensional, and we propose in this project 10 dimensions, and they have equal weighting. You have yet another approach that says, yes, 10 sounds about right as the number of dimensions, but we need to weigh them very differently. Population number actually carries 30% of the explanatory weight, and others become more small. So we said, well, with our approach, we don't need to tie ourselves to a specific definition beforehand, because that is actually detrimental in generating accumulative knowledge. Because if I write up a paper with certain conclusions, and Anthony says here, well, I have a different view, but I tweak the definition of social complexity and I throw in a few other variables and kick out some, we are at cross purposes. So what we did was actually said, let's look at the entire body of literature that was published on social complexity. Let's look at what people ever proposed as dimensions going into it. And these were 53 dimensions. So nobody ever proposed that there were 53 dimensions, but in all the past definitions, you could argue there were 53 variables in there, which cluster around 8 or 9 themes: hierarchy, population, polity, and so on. And then we run some data science techniques, principal component analysis, and said, to what extent do all these variables, all these dimensions trend in the same direction? And is this one dimension, multi-dimensional, or where are we? And basically, to our surprise, because in the social sciences, a PC, a principal component that captures variance up to in the higher 60s, it's very rare. That was actually what we found. So in a way, we found very strong evidence that social complexity was multidimensional. And this came to as a surprise, actually, to most of the team. We had assumed it was multidimensional. What it then allows you to do is to produce a kind of graphs and a different engagement with world history. There's nothing new in the graph I'm going to show you, but it's basically a stepping stone for the next work. Here you see how social complexity works out for 8 of our 30 or 42 time series. And basically at the x-axis you see time dimension, and on the y-axis you see complexity rising up. So if I just take you to the green line, which is Latium, you see it had relatively low social complexity and then shoots up with the Roman Empire and then stays through the Middle Ages, actually at the same level. There is no new information in there. Historians of that area know all that, but it's simply saying you can bring an enormous amount of data together and play around with it in a novel way, right? Now, if this is our approach on how to work with world history quantified, and we have, so this paper, for example, was published in PNAS in 2018, and this really starts to galvanize the anthropological world, because now other teams and researchers are using it and adding to it and are correlating that with whatever they have of interest with it. And that's obviously the goal we have. Now, if I now look at, if I bring the story now back to freedom of religion and belief or religious freedom, just to remind me, in a way, my main aim was to add a historical dimension to the existing body of work, which was already exists. So, what many people call the Grimm variables, which comes from a book by Brian Grimm, The Price of Freedom Denied, has produced a list of variables to say, well, if I want to measure religious freedom or freedom of religion and belief, based on country reports from the last 10 years, these are the questions or the variables I'm looking at, right? I could easily choose different list of variables, but they were very, very similar. Another, in my opinion, fantastic scholar on this topic, Jonathan Fox, has produced very similar list of variables as well. He tweaks them a little bit. Now, I think what is important here to say is that there is a clear split between governmental restrictions and societal pressures or societal restrictions. So clearly that is something, if you want to push that back in time, in history, we cannot lose. If you think about it, these are two fundamental different processes at play. Is it a kind of peer pressure of the society and usually the majority community stopping you and experiencing your religion as you would like to live, or is it actually dictated by the government or not? What most of the work here does, and so there's Grimm and Fox and the others, is actually you have those variables and then you compile an index from them. You add, in a very simple way, you could say you have 10 variables. If you score present on all of them, you have a score of 10. If you have absent on all of them, you have a score of 0. And then we look at how restrictions are climbing up or down over time. If you also see the usual suspects here, it's about the individual's right to worship. It's about attitudes to missionaries, proselytizing, very important. It's about job openings and so on and so forth. This set of variables, for my purposes, I cannot use. As in, as they are, they're great, but the moment you start pushing them back in time, say 100 years, 200 years, 1,000 years, 2,000 years, you run into trouble because it's very often tied to the individual, right? So many societies, especially societies where we have no writing, how do you know that? So we need to work with rougher proxies. So you lose precision for sure, and there are many. I'm very humble about that. You make many assumptions and clear about those, and you need to show the limitations of your work, but you do get temporal dynamics. So it's not better what I do, it's just a different approach. It's just creating a different data set and a different way out of it. So my own variables look in a way like this. And you will see there's plenty of similarity, but also different. Like one of the doings is from an individual focus to a group focus. So I kept the government restrictions, kept the societal restrictions. It's again about violence in a way which is rather underdefined. It's about proselytizing, public worship, and so on. So these variables, I tried both the Fox variables, the Grimm variables with historical data on a sample of 30 historical past societies, and I really struggled getting meaningful data. By tweaking them into this, I suddenly have usable data, usable as in for statistical analysis on hundreds of societies, But I do take the point, the results here are not straightforwardly to be mapped on the results by Jonathan Fox, Brian Grimm, and the others. They come with a caveat in a way. But this doesn't help me too much. This will help me to compose the Religious Freedom Index over the time and see how it changed over time in different cross-cultural settings and so on. But obviously, I want to understand, go back to my original question, also need to know how it ties in with other societal aspects. So one of the things that I'm also having coded for is looking at the religious demographics. So I'm very much interested in understanding, is a society with one majority religion, then a number of very small ones, or is it more an open market and saying like you have 3, 4 bigger religions, all with a sizable chunk of the population? Hang on, how does that map on the ruler, the elites, and the common population, and so on and so forth? Is the religion an official religion or not? So as the Anglican Church here is, so there's lots of in a way complexity there that you can actually capture in a handful of variables. In addition, obviously, I needed data on stability of societies. Now, obviously, the length of a society is a good starting point, but I'm also coding information. Ruler transitions, how violent are they? Is that the violence within the elite, within the general population, smooth transition, and so on? I'm having hundreds of variables on civil wars, wealth, again, and so on. But this is not data gathered as part of this project. This is part of previous projects, so we already have that data. So in a way, just as I showed you how we put together a social complexity index, we can have a wealth index, we can have a stability index, we can have a combustibility index as well, but we also have a religious freedom index. And then we can start playing around with those different indexes and look for trends, patterns. So where are we in the process? So the FCDO project, we have the data on virtually all past societies on religious tolerance and freedom of on the religious freedom. We have gathered the data on religious demography. The peace and prosperity variables we're still putting together at the moment, but I hope to have finalized that within 6 months. And at the moment, my main worry or big job is putting the statistical team together once that data is there to really delve into it. So what I hope, and I'm going to slowly round up my talk with that, and then we have another 20 minutes or so for questions, is that I hope to have put on the table a different approach, which is complementary to both the social sciences and the historical approach, that adds a new approach and data set into the mix and allows you to revisit some of the key questions with a different data set. And I hope I have also demonstrated that once this is fully up and running, that it will help us to some extent better understand the key question: how does religious freedom lead to more peaceful and cohesive societies, and the other way around? I think for that, the temporal dynamics were important. The life cycle understanding is important, but especially we need to go within the international development world away from let's open the tap of religion, let's support financially religious freedom or close it down. No, it's much more nuanced. We need to know when to intervene, when to support, when to promote, rather than saying it's an all or nothing approach. And I think this is in a way where the interest of the FCDO lies, that they are saying, well, we want to see the value for money of this focus towards religion of the last 20 years. How can we demonstrate that? How can we go away from those rather stark discussions we're seeing now in invest or not invest? And I believe in a way that my work is not a threat to people promoting freedom of religion or belief and religious freedom at all. It is simply to shift the debate to a more empirical basis. And I think there will be plenty of work to do in these fields, but that this is a necessary step to make. I'm going to close my talk at this.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Now we have to do some. Well, first of all, this.